back in verse 31 of Matthew, we're told Jesus is led away to the cross. And at this point, I want to revisit this timeline just to clear up this misconception. Commonly, you'll hear people say that Jesus died on a Friday, but the Bible never really names a specific day. The view that he died on a Friday comes from this reference to the Jewish Sabbath and a tradition called a day of preparation. All the Gospels report that the evening on the day Jesus died was the beginning of a Sabbath. And that Sabbath, and the day before a Sabbath, was called a day of preparation because the Jews used that day to prepare for the Sabbath. Since they couldn't do any work on a Sabbath day, they would use that day to do all the things they needed to do, gather firewood, make bread, whatever they needed to do to prepare for the day of the Sabbath. So when the gospel writers say Jesus died on a day of preparation, many assume that it was a Friday, the day before the Sabbath. But we find out that isn't what the gospel writers meant when we look a little more closely at those accounts, and it begins with understanding how Jews celebrated Passover. Passover is just a single feast. It's held every year on a day called the 14th of Nisan. And Nisan is just a Jewish month, and this is roughly around March or April for us. So Passover begins in the evening, just like every other Jewish day, and that night, Jesus had the Last Supper, followed by his death the next day. Passover is always followed immediately by a second feast called the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which lasts for 7 days. And in the law, the Lord told Israel that the first day and the last day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread would always be a Sabbath. So the first and last days are Sabbaths, and it doesn't matter what day of the week that they fall on. And these special Sabbaths, they are called high day Sabbaths or high days, and they are observed in addition to the regular weekly Sabbath. So Passover is always followed by a Sabbath called a high day Sabbath, which means every Passover is also a day of preparation. So Jesus is crucified on a day of preparation because he was crucified on Passover, and the next day was a high day Sabbath. And John gives us confirmation of that in his account. John 19:31 says, "Then the Jews, because it was a day of preparation, so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away." John says Jesus died on a day of preparation before a high day Sabbath, not a regular weekly Sabbath day. So that means Jesus could have died on any day. And in fact, we know he didn't die on a Friday. He could have died any day of the week except for a Friday. If he had died on a Friday, then the next day would have just been a regular Sabbath, not a high day Sabbath, as John says. And when we get into chapter 28, we will learn that the day after Jesus died was a Friday, which means Jesus had to die on a Thursday. All right, which also says that in this particular week that Jesus died, there were 2 Sabbaths in a row. Okay, he died on the high day. The day after he died was the high day Sabbath, and the next day was Saturday, which was just the normal Sabbath. And then the third day was Sunday, the first day of the week, and that day is a third feast, the Feast of First Fruits. So God orchestrated it so no one could visit the grave until Jesus was gone. Now, that's not, if you grew up your whole life thinking that it was Friday, it's not like that's such a super serious thing, or it's kind of insignificant and mostly harmless. But that also goes to speak to a little bit of a bigger problem. We get comfortable depending on church tradition rather than us actually learning Scripture. And especially if you grew up in church, have to assume like we all carry around bad assumptions and bad traditions and bad teaching that we've just collected over the years. And just because you grew up in church, that doesn't make you immune. Before listening to this, ask yourself, did you believe that Jesus died on a Friday? And why did you believe that? And where did you read that in the Bible? So, in fact, double check what you're listening to me say right now. Study to show yourself approved, right? So, moving on to verse 32, and immediately you'll notice right away how much Matthew just packs into this single verse. Matthew 27:32 says, "As they were coming out, they found a man of Cyrene named Simon, whom they pressed into service to bear his cross." Now, this is the only verse that Matthew devotes to the entire journey. And because he jumps so quickly, let's just slow down for a bit. First, okay, Jesus is leaving the Antonian fortress where Pilate condemned him before the crowds. The fortress is located inside the city walls. It's right by the temple, and the crucifixion site sits on a small hill just outside the city walls. Okay, today there's a memorial path that you can walk that isn't exactly what Jesus took, but kind of close to it. It's called the Via Dolorosa, which is the way of suffering in Latin. And the distance from the fortress to the crucifixion site is about 500 meters. So, like maybe about a third of a mile. Average person can walk it in 10 minutes or less. But you got to remember, given Jesus' debilitated state following the beatings and the scourging, he would have found that walk to be an ordeal. And adding to that difficulty is that the Romans forced the condemned to carry their cross to the crucifixion site. Now, the Romans used any one of 4 different cross designs for crucifixion, so we can't be sure which type that they used in Jesus' day, but based on certain details in the story, the traditional T-shaped cross was likely the one used for Jesus. And if so, Jesus would have carried only the horizontal beam to the crucifixion site. The beam would be placed on the prisoner's shoulders and tied, that's a tongue twister, and tied to his arms for a walk. The beam wasn't especially large or heavy, it's just large enough to support their weight. But Jesus is in no condition to carry anything. He can barely carry himself. So this task this task was impossible. And that's the evidence we see in verse 32. We're told as soon as Jesus picks up his cross, he begins to walk. He falls right away. The Roman guards realize Jesus can't make it on his own. So they grab this passerby named Simon. It says that he is from Cyrene, which is a place in North Africa. So he was in Jerusalem for the Passover along with 2 million other Jews. He's trying to get to the temple for the 9 a.m. Passover lamb being sacrificed. And now he's required by these guards to follow Jesus for the entire walk to the crucifixion site carrying this wooden beam. And here's another opportunity for us to correct a common misconception about Jesus' death. Jesus didn't carry his own cross, except for this brief moment at the very beginning of the journey. He also didn't fall down 3 times like the Catholics say. For the most part, Jesus walked to his death carrying nothing because, that's really all that he can even barely manage to do. He could barely walk at all. So Simon is forced to carry Jesus' cross, which is, much more than an inconvenience because he's now a participant in the horrors of crucifixion. Now, even though he wasn't nailed to the cross, he still shared in the abuse that Jesus endured on the way there. As an accused walked to his execution site, he traveled through densely packed crowds and narrow city streets. And these crowds would press in on these people. They would jeer at them, hurl abuse, spit on them, throw objects, even throw in a punch if they were close enough. And in these tight, chaotic quarters, anybody near Jesus would have found themselves in the crossfire. Now, although the abuse wasn't intended for Simon, those people with poor aim throwing rocks that would hit him or, spit on him or a missed punch, whatever that hit him, those would still sting. And here's a lesson for all of us. The closer Simon walked with Jesus, the more abuse came his way. At the same time, Simon's role also gained him the benefit of a front row seat to witness Jesus' personal suffering. Now, interestingly, this man, his name is Simon, the same as Jesus' chief disciple, Peter, whose original name was Simon. So we have one Simon present that day following Jesus, while the other Simon, the rock, he's not there. I wonder, what if Peter had been present that day? Maybe they would have said, hey, you're one of his homies. You carry it for him. After all, Jesus assigned Simon Peter the responsibility of leading the early church and for setting the example for everyone else. Peter was the rock upon which Jesus would start building his church, and yet, where was he now? He was hiding somewhere, trying to avoid the abuse that was falling on Jesus, while this other Simon took his place. Which is a reminder for all of us that if we won't walk with Jesus, and if we won't serve him, Jesus will find somebody else who will. Now, Matthew doesn't record any of the details from the journey to the cross, but other gospel writers record one notable moment. John and Luke tells us that following Jesus were these women who were wailing loudly over his predicament. But these women were not truly lamenting Jesus' fate. In fact, they probably didn't even know him. These women, they were just professional mourners, and they would wail and lament for income. In Jewish culture, it was considered dishonorable for someone to die without someone expressing sorrow for them. This expectation gave a rise to these professional mourners. They were like car window washers. You know, they run out, they clean your windshield while you're sitting at a stoplight, and then they want you to pay them after the fact. So these women would do this, and then the family members of the deceased would compensate them for their work in honoring their relative. So when Jesus sees these women mourning for him, he knows nobody's going to pay them. So he offers them compensation in the form of advice. Luke tells us that as he's following and these women are mourning and lamenting, he says, Jesus, turning to them, said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, stop weeping for me, but weep for yourselves and your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us." So Jesus offers these women a warning prophecy concerning the coming judgment of Jerusalem. He tells them to save their crying for their own children at the time of the future destruction of their city. And this judgment came against Jerusalem for their rejection of Jesus as it came to pass in 70 AD. That's when the Romans laid siege to the city for 2 years. There was no food in, and after all the food was eaten and all the animals were eating, according to history, the women started eating their afterbirth and even their children. So he's showing concern for these women, and Simon is there, and he is witness to this, which showing concern for people on your way to be crucified was obviously not the norm. And then Matthew verse 33, it says, when they came to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. I'm going to stop. I know it's really weird in the middle of the sentence, but so Jesus exits the city. He gets to this place called Golgotha, which is just a few meters outside the city walls. It's translated as the place of the skull because, the Romans executed a lot of people there. So prisoners carried their horizontal beam, and then their crucifixion would begin. And this would be very quickly and very brutally. So first, they would lay down, arms outstretched on the horizontal beam, and these thick iron nails were driven through the wrist. In John's gospel, we're told he had wounds in his hands, but in the ancient world, the word hand also referred to the wrist, and we know the palm's not strong enough to support the weight of a person. So we know that they must have gone through the wrist. And then as the nails penetrate, you get severed ligaments and nerves, causing shooting pain, involuntary contractions in the fingers. Then this horizontal beam is raised with a hoist or ropes, and the person's lifted with their outstretched arms. These things aren't 20 feet in the air like you see sometimes. It was just enough to make sure the person is off the ground. But as they hoist this up, the body weight is hanging with the outstretched arms, and one or both of the shoulders are likely dislocated, which I've never had that, but I've been around somebody who has. So again, we have more intense pain. Then the horizontal beam is nailed to the vertical beam, and the man's feet are nailed one on top of the other to the vertical beam. The feet are positioned so that the knees are bent, which was another Roman innovation to extend the suffering of crucifixion. While hanging in this position, the man's diaphragm can't expand the chest cavity, so the person can't breathe. And so according to Mark, Jesus is put in this position on the cross on the third hour, which is 9 a.m. And this begins the first of 3 time divisions for that day. Okay, and this one runs from 9 a.m. to noon. And so during that time, Jesus is suffering the actions of mankind. Sinful men put Jesus on the cross that day, and sinful men are tormenting Jesus as he hangs there. This 3-hour period serves the purpose of Jesus experiencing the consequences of sin. Not his, but ours. Spiritually speaking, each of us put Jesus on the cross that day. And if you think you would have done any better, you got to think again. There's nothing fundamental